Goodness me. Thank you, Brendan, for that most gracious introduction. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, IAW&A and IAC. Thank you, and thank you. I'd like to read a scene from the Paris manuscript. The year is 1919. The place is Paris. Ned Jameson, a journalist and veteran of the Great War, is attending a party given by Alexander and Beatrice Shelton Drake. He is accompanied by his wife, Daisy. Also in attendance is a mutual friend, the reclusive novelist Marcel Proust, who's made a rare excursion into the outside world to speak with the Shelton Drake's cook. He needs some culinary information for the book he's labored on for the past 6 years, À la recherche du temps perdu, or Remembrance of Things Past, or In Search of Lost Time, whichever one you prefer. This scene occurs about halfway through the party. Beatrice, looking worried, approached us. "Something wrong?" Sandy said. "Is Marcel all right?" Daisy said. "He's fine. That's not the problem." "Then what is it?" Sandy said. Beatrice took his arm. "Come with me." "You too," she said to us. "Where's Marcel?" I asked. "In the kitchen," she said curtly. "At least that's where I left him." Dodging and weaving, fighting to keep up, Daisy and I followed the Shelton Drakes through the mass of partygoers. What could have happened? Why all the hurry? Beatrice led us into a quiet room. An unhappy-looking servant stood uncomfortably beside a divan. A well-dressed young man sat indolently smoking a cigarette in an overstuffed chair. His Homburg, overcoat, and gloves were neatly draped over a nearby end table. An older woman in an evening gown and gloves turned to us when we entered. "Sandy, it's about time." "What in heaven's name is wrong, Winnie?" "I'll tell you what's wrong." She pointed indignantly at the young man. "He took it." "Took what?" "Nothing," the young man said lazily. "The dear old thing is sadly mistaken." "You wretched boy," the woman said. "Don't think you can lie your way out of this." She indicated the servant with a plump hand. "He saw you take it." The young man was unfazed. "He's lying. 10 to 1, he took it." The older lady rode over the young man. "Don't listen to this wastrel, this. Sandy raised a peremptory hand and growled, "Quiet, please." "Now, first things first. Ned, Daisy, allow me to present Mrs. Winifred Lee, a dear friend of ours." "How do you do?" we said. Her response was a preoccupied, "How do you do?" "Now, my lad," Sandy said, "just who are you and what do you have to say for yourself?" "I am Prince Antoine de Toth," the sullen young man said, as if everyone in the world knew that but us. "I am at present attached to the Hungarian embassy." The door opened and Marcel peered in. I beg your pardon, am I interrupting?" Beatrice waved him in. "Please join us. I think you may be of some help here." Marcel's curiosity was piqued. "What is the problem?" "It's very simple," Mrs. Lee said. "This reprehensible boy was seen coming out of the cloakroom. And then, not 5 minutes later, I went to the cloakroom to get an address for someone. I carry a little notebook with addresses and such, and I discovered that someone had taken a substantial sum of money from my purse." "Whoever it was," the young man said, "it wasn't me." Sandy ran a speculative hand over his beard. "You saw him in the cloakroom? You're sure of this?" he said to the servant. "Absolutely, monsieur." "Then what?" "At some point shortly thereafter, I was approached by Mrs. Lee, who was distraught." The older woman took over. "I wasn't distraught. I was livid. One doesn't expect to be robbed in the home of friends." Hands clasped behind his back, Sandy approached the young man. "What do you have to say in your defense?" "Not a damned thing." "You watch your tone," Sandy said. "There are ladies present." Toth rose to his feet. "1,000 pardons," he bowed deeply, then sat down again. "Had you been in the cloakroom?" "I had, actually." "For what reason?" "I needed another handkerchief. I'd lent the one I had on me to a lovely young thing who'd spilled wine on her dress. I had a spare handkerchief in my overcoat. It sounds silly, I know, but that's why I went in there." Marcel stepped forward. "Did you leave the stained handkerchief in your overcoat, monsieur?" "As a matter of fact, I did." "Then you have both handkerchiefs on your person, yes?" "That's right." "May I see them?" De Toth considered Marcel's question, then reached into the right-hand pocket of his jacket and withdrew a white handkerchief blotched with red. Here. Marcel examined the handkerchief, then handed it back. And the other? The young man reached into his left-hand jacket pocket and produced a second handkerchief, the duplicate of the first, but with no wine stain. Marcel looked at it, then returned it. I hope this settles the matter, de Toth said. I'm sorry, madame, if something was stolen from you, but as you see, I only went to the cloakroom for a fresh handkerchief, not your money. Someone in my position has no need to steal pocket change. I could tell that Mrs. Lee wanted to be assuaged, wanted the situation resolved. I see that, yes, she said reluctantly, but the money, if you didn't take it, then who? I assure you, it wasn't me, and I'll be happy to prove it. He unbuttoned and removed his jacket, held it by the coattails, and shook it till its contents, a pack of cigarettes, a gold lighter, the 2 handkerchiefs, a slim leather wallet, and several calling cards, fell to the floor. He tossed the jacket onto the seat of a chair, then turned out his shirt pockets and his pants pockets. They too contained nothing. Not a franc, not a sou, not a cent, madame. Surely you can see that. Perhaps, Mrs. Lee began, perhaps I was wrong, but you were an honest mistake, madame. He put his jacket on and picked up his belongings from the carpet and tucked them back into his pockets. Now, Monsieur Shelton Drake, if you've no objection. Sandy roused himself from a clouded reverie. What? Oh, no objections. No objections, whatever. Then I bid you good night, the young man said, and started for the door. Prince de Toth? The young man stopped at the sound of Marcel's voice. Before you leave us, would you be so kind as to take off your shoes? What? I trust I spoke clearly, Marcel said lightly. I asked you to take off your shoes. Why? I should like to inspect them. De Toth looked at each of us in turn. Who is this man? Monsieur Marcel Proust, your humble servant. The young man thought for a moment. Oh, I've heard of you. You're that novelist. In de Toth's mouth, the word was poison. You do me a great honor, Marcel said. I also hear you're an invert. Mrs. Lee gasped. Daisy and Beatrice exchanged quick, nervous looks, as did Sandy and I. We all knew about Marcel's predilections, but we refrained from discussing them. If you loved Marcel, as we did, you accepted him as he was. Marcel was seemingly unruffled. What I am or what I am not has nothing to do with the matter at hand. More to the point is the fact that you are a crook. Your shoes, sir, please remove them. I will not. It's ridiculous, ludicrous. Then you leave me no other choice. Marcel took off his top hat and placed it on a side table. Sandy, Ned, will you assist me? Sandy looked incredulous. You want us to help you remove this fellow's shoes? That is precisely what I want. Because, I said, because he has hidden the money in one of them. You're out of your mind, de Toth said. You belong in an asylum. You may be right, Marcel said, but that too has nothing to do with the matter at hand. Are you sure about this? Sandy said. Marcel considered the question. Reasonably. Sandy looked at me. I nodded. All right, he said. Come on, Ned. One moment. Marcel turned to the young man. I have no wish to use force if it can be avoided. I have no desire to rob you of what little dignity you may possess. Therefore, I shall ask you one more time. Will you please return the money you stole from the lady? The young man's eyes narrowed unpleasantly. I told you, I didn't steal anything. Marcel sighed. Gentlemen, Sandy and I moved towards de Toth, who quickly backed away from us. We each caught an arm and dragged him, cursing and struggling, to the center of the room. Sandy wrapped him in a bear hug while I grabbed one of the young man's legs and wrestled first one shoe, then the other off. I brought them to Marcel, who inspected them. Well, Sandy said, breathing heavily from his exertions. Empty, Marcel said, both of them. I told you, a red-faced de Toth gasped. I didn't take the old bitch's money. What should I do with this lout? Sandy said. Let him go or beat the stuffing out of him? Neither, Marcel said. Please remove his socks. DeToth stamped hard on Sandy's foot, broke the bigger man's hold, and bolted for the door. I caught him by the collar and hauled him back. He stumbled into me, and we both fell. I wound up straddling his chest and pinning his wrist to the ground, while Sandy grasped a flailing foot and tore off a sock. Anything? I said. No. Sandy reached for the other foot. Stop kicking, damn you. There. You got it? I asked Sandy, who remained silent. Let him up, Ned, Marcel said. I released DeToth's wrists, stood up, and moved away from the disheveled young man. He crawled off and sat curled in a ball against the divan. I told you I didn't have it, he said, his eyes bright with hatred. I told you. My heartfelt apologies, Sandy began. I no intention of... The young man waved away Sandy's words. Forget it. All I wish to do is leave you poltroons to your rancid celebrations. He favored Mrs. Lee with a wintry smile. I hope you're happy, madame. Your wrong-headed accusations have brought shame upon you and your friends. I should sue every one of you for slander and assault. Instead, I'll wish you all a tender and heartfelt good night. He crossed toward the end table where his hat, coat, and gloves rested. Allow me, Marcel said, stepping between DeToth and the end table. He picked up the overcoat and held it out for DeToth. DeToth, surprised and convinced that others would naturally choose to serve him, inserted one arm and then the other into his overcoat. Marcel presented the young man with his Homburg. Then he picked up DeToth's gloves. He offered one to the young man, who took it and waited for Marcel to hand him the second glove. And waited. And waited. And waited. DeToth stared at Marcel. Marcel, smiling dreamily, stared back. The silence stretched on. And still, Marcel did not return the glove. The tension in the room increased with each passing second. And still, Marcel, smiling dreamily, did not return the glove. And then, at the very apogee of emotional strain, when one must speak or die, act or collapse, DeToth spun around and stormed out of the room. We blinked and breathed and stirred from the waking dream in which we'd found ourselves. Sandy spoke for us all. What in the name of God was that? Holding it by its index finger, Marcel shook the glove the young man had abandoned so precipitately. He gave it another shake and another, and banknotes fell to the carpet. Marcel stooped over to pick them up. What was the amount missing, Madame Lee? 600 francs, monsieur. Marcel counted the notes, placing each one carefully on the end table. We watched the notes pile up, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, and 600 francs. It is, madame. Marcel proffered the stack of notes to Mrs. Lee. Had it all along, the insolent pup, Sandy said. I'd like to give him the thrashing of his life. How did you know he had the money? Mrs. Lee asked. I wouldn't go so far as to say I knew, Marcel said. I thought it likely based on his behavior. How do you mean? Beatrice said. It struck me as curious, Marcel said, that without being asked, Prince DeToth voluntarily demonstrated that his jacket, shirt, and trouser pockets were empty. But when I asked him to remove his shoes, he refused. Now, what conclusion was I to draw from that? That he'd hidden the money in his shoes, I said. But he hadn't, Daisy said. No, he hadn't, Marcel agreed. He didn't wish to remove his shoes and socks because he felt it was beneath his dignity. He's a very vain young man, very proud. I noticed, Beatrice said. A bit of thought shows that such a course of action does not serve a thief well. To remove a shoe and a sock and tuck the money away, then put the shoe and sock back on takes time. Time a thief can't spare. Therefore, I didn't think that was the actual hiding place. Then why did you want us to search his shoes and socks, I said. Marcel's expression turned dark. He spoke of matters of which he had no right to speak. I wanted to see him humiliated. I'm not proud of this, but it is the truth. He adjusted his top hat. Madame Lee has her money, and I have the recipe I need for my book. I trust you will forgive me if I leave you. My manuscript awaits, and time passes so quickly. Thank you.